Revolution, Inflation, and Putschs, Orlow, Chapter 4. Towards the end of the war, there was a general mistrust and dislike of authority, which, especially among the military, soldiers and sailors, which is entirely understandable because they were promised a quick victory and they've been fighting for several years. So there was this sense of euphoria going off to war and strong distrust coming back from the war. And it didn't help that the emperor had just fled the country, so the people would have been feeling betrayed and depressed and unhappy. And as a result of all of that, as a result of all of that distrust, the army and the navy started forming, or the soldiers and the sailors rather, started forming these councils to kind of check the authority, the military leaders, the dock workers, supplementary workers in those fields and supporting the military also joined in, and so they formed these councils where they would not allow any regulations set up by authority to be passed until they had been approved by these councils. It certainly didn't help matters that the Navy authorities, decided that they wanted to send their fleet out on one last mission to give Great Britain a hard time. Days before the armistice. They knew it was coming and they wanted to make a statement or something. And word got around about that, and then there was a mutiny in 1917. Resulted in, I think, 10, 12 casualties and 2 executions. And then this idea of creating a council really caught on and spread throughout the country. Going back to the function of the council system, the councils that they set up, there was a sort of a dual lines aspect to it, because you have the councils that have authority because people have given them authority, and then you have the authorities who have authority because that's tradition. And actually it worked better than one might have thought. It was probably efficient isn't the best word, but it worked for a while. Not long after that, or rather during while all that was going on, the Wittelsbach dynasty fell in Bavaria, and this kind of sent a shock to other leaders in Germany and the surrounding areas. There's no support for the ancient and traditional systems of government anymore, so a lot of other rulers, monarchy abdicated in that time period. Wilhelm II did not. The people, lots of people urged him to. The prime minister at the time, von Baden, Max von Baden, took it upon himself to announce the abdication of the emperor. It was not really constitutional, but he did it anyway. And then he also chose Friedrich Ebert to succeed him, which was not really constitutional either, but he did it anyway. And so Ebert took on that role, and he became Germany's first social democratic Reich chancellor. During this time, there was a general fear of communism. Everything was confusing and chaotic in the time between the armistice and the Treaty of Versailles, and people were fearful that what had happened in Russia would happen in Germany. The Weimar Constitution afforded universal suffrage. The Prussian system of voting had the three-class system where each vote had a different weight. That was gotten rid of. All men and women over the age of 20 had a vote. The German National People's Party was comprised mostly of the leftover conservative oligarchs. It had a lot of the same principles and a lot of the same people, but it tried to broaden its voting appeal to include businessmen, professionals, white-collar workers, and so it grew in popularity, but not for long. And it was strong. While it was strong in northern Germany, where the Protestants were prevalent, and it also another thing it did, it projected an image of like progressive conservatism, which effectively rejected all things Marxist, and that's one of the reasons it grew in popularity. The National Liberals comprised the German People's Party. It was poorly organized, and it did have a voting appeal to the urban upper and middle classes among the industrialists and business executives, but it was poorly organized, so it didn't last that long. The German Democratic Party again appealed to the middle class industrialists, professionals, white-collar workers, farmers. It marketed itself as a party that could hold a socialist's radical tendencies in check. Again, there's that fear of Marxism. Again, there's poor organization. The voting support was not organized, and so it wasn't able to sustain itself. The National Assembly was tasked with, well, it had two functions at this time. It was tasked with writing a new constitution, and it was tasked with provisional right legislature, so supplementary governing documents. It is called the Weimar Constitution because you would think it had met in Berlin. It did not. It met in Weimar, which is a small town that once was the home of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. People were proud of that heritage, that fact, in that town. There was also, more significantly, there was concern about the safety of the delegates in Berlin. This was a touchy subject for many, and there had been some safety concerns in Berlin, so they moved out to a small town. There were two concerns in drafting the Constitution. The nature of the Reich's future political system was one, and then concerns for revisions in the actual structure. So the ideology of where we're taking this country, and then actually how does this look, were the two things that they wanted to address at that time. The Constitution was actually modeled after France and Great Britain. Again, it granted universal suffrage. There was fairly proportional representation. They had somewhat of a division in government. There was a national, or a division of power in government. There was a national and a state government, or parliament, sorry. The executive in the system was subject to control by the Reichstag. It was largely ceremonial, or at least in intent. The executive was largely ceremonial, and the cabinet, the president, the executive, was elected by popular vote, but it was largely ceremonial, and his cabinet was held accountable. The national parliament had to have confidence in their ability to serve, or else they would be dismissed. The Treaty of Versailles was considered a one-sided pact. Germany had no bargaining power. It was primarily arranged by the U.S., Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau in France, and David Lloyd George in Great Britain. Wilson kind of backed out towards the end, so it was mainly arranged by France and Britain. There were heavy reparations imposed upon the Germans, and the Germans were given the document, the treaty, to comment and edit, but they returned it full of comments and edits and critiques. And the Allies effectively said, sorry, accept this or risk a new war. Germany didn't have resources to start a new war, so the reparations that were imposed, or were proposed to be imposed, were actually imposed. One of the purposes in the heavy reparations was for Germans to assist in the Allies' recuperation. Everybody blamed Germany for the war. One of the conditions in restoring relationships, international relations, was that Germany accept that it was at fault. And so, with that understanding, the Allies thought it would make sense. Well, it's their fault. They should help us to repair our own economies and pay us for all the damages that we've suffered. They also ran with this idea that it would bring this new sense of morality and justice in international relations because it was fair, brutally fair, if Germany was in fact at fault for the war. Germany suffered reduced territory, population, and limited military. It wasn't as bad as it could have been as far as the reduced territory goes. The inhabitants of the disputed territories were asked to vote whether they wanted to remain in the Reich or become citizens of another state, and with the exception of 2 locations, they got what they wanted. France got Alsace-Lorraine back, and then there was, I think it's on the next slide, but the military was limited to 100,000 men. They were forbidden to continue universal military service, build military airplanes or submarines, maintain naval ships larger than a certain weight, or have land weapons. The Reich could not impose tariffs on imports from Allied companies until 1925. The war had left Germany in a really rocky place. They didn't have the resources to sustain a war like they had just fought, so they were malnourished. They had run down transportation and production facilities. There was a decline in public morality, and then with the poor economic conditions, there was a black market that raised up or started up. The industrialists the German mark significantly decreased in value, but the industrialists, it was hard to do business in those economic conditions. So there wasn't really any economic competition, which automatically makes the prices rise, which just makes the entire system worse for the individual trying to put food on the table. The farmers and urban landlords, at first they benefited from the inflation because their mortgages were just wiped out, but then as time went by they started to resent the unfair government measures to protect urban consumers. The landlords hated the rent controls that were imposed upon them. The farmers hated the price controls that were placed on their products. The reparations, the total number, so to speak, of the reparations, the debt that Germany owed the Allies was 132 billion gold marks, which is quite a lot. In 1941, that would have been 31.4 billion. And the Allies were all united in ensuring that the Germans repaid their debts, but they all were not quite on the same page as to how, and we're out of time. Great Britain recognized that Germany kind of needed to return to economic success in order for the general economy in Europe to return to its former prosperity. It's 10:50. Do you want me to keep going?
How much you have left? Well, keep going. Go
two sides. Okay. So the counter-revolution, the first 4 years were unstable and politically violent. A lot of people didn't like the new democratic system that was imposed upon them. A lot of people didn't, again, going back to the mentality going into the war and coming out of it, they didn't feel like they had gotten what they had promised. The Free Corps,
Yeah, you still have a minute anyway.
oh, okay, my computer's fast. They were a voluntary military unit designed to supplement the inadequate armed forces to deal with territorial issues. The Polish were trying to encroach in the east in 1919, so they needed some sort of military body to deal with that, but they couldn't have actually a military. And then they kind of got radicalized. There were groups of the Free Corps that became radicalized, came to believe that their experiences in the war and their success in saving Germany from Bolshevism had lifted them to a higher state of consciousness than that of a political soldier. So they took this really seriously. They eventually stood up against the Versailles democracy and dissolution. The putsch, or coup, the Kapp-Leutwitz putsch was a result of Kapp, who was a frustrated politician of East Prussian agricultural official, and Leutwitz, who was a simple-minded officer who thought that military dictatorship would just take away all of Germany's problems. So they tried to revolt against the revolution, counter-revolution, and they had a limited success. They won their coup, but it lasted for 5 days, and then they had horrible organization, and it just fell flat. The German Workers' Party, here we see Adolf Hitler enter the scene because he joined the party, and then soon after that became chief of propaganda, and then in 1921 he became the actual leader of the Nazi Party. He quit his job with the Bavarian military, but he continued to have a good relationship with it. He had their support to organize and coordinate this putsch, but at the very last minute they pulled out, so he was on his own. He got allies out of it, but after about a couple hours they backed out on him, and the police that were there to deal with it, it's a beer hall putsch, shots were fired. The conspirators ran off, fled, dispersed, and then they were eventually caught and brought into prison. And then foreign relations.
How many screens you got?
This is it.
The last one? Okay,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So the dampening fires refers to the conflicts that were happening on the borders. Again, like a lot of people voted to stay part of Germany. Some of them left Germany. Silesia and Austria are two of the groups that did not get exactly what they wished. Austria voted to stay part of Germany. The Allies didn't want that to happen. They feared the power that could come from the two being united. And then Silesia, part of it was granted to Germany, but the economic coal-rich, economic beneficial lands of the northern Silesia, I guess. Northern, yes. Were given to Poland for economic purposes. France did not trust Germany at all, and actually had started to create like a belt of security and allies in the newly independent Southern Europe or Southeastern Europe. And then Great Britain backed Russia, or what stayed buddies with France the entire time. Russia, they actually had their Treaty of Rapallo, which was more significant than anything because both of them were broke and they had no real power. So it was significant, but it was threatening to the Allies as well.
Okay, just 1 second before you go.